Okay, folks, welcome. This is Steve Kruger from Trailkeepers of Oregon. Welcome to our session today on trails recovery in fire-affected areas, lessons learned in safety and restoration. This is a part of the Oregon Outdoor Recreation Summit. We're mighty thankful for all our summit sponsors and today's speakers for making today's session possible on the fly, specifically because this is a fill-in from a Region 6 Forest Service slot that had to get pushed later into the month. Steph Knoll behind the scenes is providing tech support. So if you have technical questions related to Zoom, you can use the chat feature, and you should find in your control bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can ask Steph questions there. We also welcome attendees to introduce themselves in the chat using the to all panelists and attendees setting so folks can get a sense of who else is on the call. Let us know who you are and who you work with or volunteer with. As an attendee, you can virtually raise your hand, your blue hand, and submit questions also in the Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during presentations using the Q&A function, not the chat function, by the way. We'll have time for today's presenters to respond to questions at the end of the session. So we won't have too much because we really want to jump into things. This webinar is going to be recorded and it'll be available later on in the fall through the Travel Oregon YouTube channel. Summit hosts will send out the recording links to all summit participants when they're ready. That goofy photo of me, I'm atop Upper McCord in Yeon in the Columbia Gorge. I'm Steve Kruger, the Executive Director of Trailkeepers of Oregon. I'm also a board member of the Oregon Trails Coalition and on the advisory and on the planning team for the summit. So welcome. And again, our summit sponsors, thank you so much for all your support. We couldn't do it without you all. This is truly a great representation of Oregon's supporters of outdoor recreation. So this summit kind of came along. This is a photo of the burned area in the Columbia Gorge. As the wildfires jumped up and there was a missing slot to be filled, I suggested to Steph, hey, I know some folks that probably could really speak to the things that went on in the process after the wildfire in the Columbia Gorge, the Eagle Creek fire. And, you know, some of that process, this here is January of 2018, 4 months after the fire started. And this was a trip with PCTA, my first trip. Actually, one of our presenters is looking back at me in this photo. This is along the first section of the Pacific Crest Trail from Cascade Locks towards Herman Creek. This is Dry Creek Falls, I think. I'm probably wrong, Roberta, sorry. All the things that come in place. This is a poignant time for us to be talking about burned area emergency response assessments and summaries, incident risk assessment worksheets, the job hazard analysis, or now called the risk assessments, safety checklists, and specific safety checklists for burned area crews. So a lot of things out there that come into play, how partners can be a resource for our land managers after fires go through our recreational areas and trails. So we have 3 speakers today. I'd love to introduce them. I'm actually gonna stop sharing Susan, Roberta, and Gabe so that you can actually see their shining faces. And let's see, who was first on that photo list? Susan, you wanna start off?
Sure, I'm Susan Schen. I've been a volunteer and crew leader with Trailkeepers of Oregon for about 4 years. I was on staff as the coast stewardship coordinator, bringing up our efforts on the Oregon Coast Trail with funding from our partner out there, the Oregon Coast Visitors Association. During the aftermath of the Eagle Creek fire, I led a few dozen trail parties with TKO, working on Angel's Rest, the Large Mountain Trail, the Joaquina Trail, and a few others. So I'm excited to be able to share some of what I learned today.
Great. Roberta?
Hi, I'm Roberta May, and I have been a volunteer with the Pacific Crest Trail Association since the mid-90s, so I've got a lot of experience. I currently am a caretaker, which means kind of a steward of the Pacific Crest Trail Pacific Crest Trail from Bridge of the Gods, heading south in Oregon for about 4 miles. And during and after the Eagle Creek fire, I was the chair of Mount Hood chapter of the PCTA, and we mounted a big effort to get those trails reopened.
Great. Thanks, Roberta. Gabe?
Hi, my name is Gabe Howe, and I'm Executive Director of Siskiyou Mountain Club. We've been working for the last decade in Southwest Oregon and Northwest California, and as it turns out, primarily in fire areas. So I'm excited to be here today and hopefully be able to share some insight and lessons learned from over the years doing that work.
And you definitely have the best background. That's the real deal, fireside chats with Gabe. So thank you for that. Okay, let's see. I lost my screen. There we go. Sorry, folks. One sec. All right. So our wonderful panelists, we're going to go in different orders through this. I'll do the best I can to stick to their slides. We have 4 questions to them. We'll go one question at a time and rotate through the panelists. So, and I think Steph Noel, you're going to copy these questions and put them in the chat window so people can scan them and add comments as we go to follow along. So, first up, take it away, Gabe.
So in the context of this question, I'm just going to say that, we work with a lot of volunteers and staff. So, I'll kind of describe the initial steps in the context of using staff and volunteers. And as soon as the fire closures lift, we're getting in there to make evaluations. We're not doing a whole lot of work that first season. Well, that first, fall and winter season after the rains hit. But we're getting in there, like in this example, in the footprint of the 2017 Chetco bar fire, and just hiking the trails and making an evaluation on burn severity that we're able to get on the ground that we're not able to get in reports. And the planning starts then. So as far as field work actually commencing, typically that starts the next spring as soon as the snow lifts and conditions allow for us to get in there. So we like getting in there just as soon as we can.
Okay, looks like we have Roberta up next.
Yeah, so in our experience with the Eagle Creek fire, this fire started Labor Day weekend, and by October, we were already in meetings, set up meetings with the Pacific Crest Trail Association, with the Forest Service, with Trailkeepers of Oregon, Washington Trails, and Friends of the Gorge. So we had quite a big group of people that we formed a coalition with. And then we had, the PCTA has a long experience and good relationship with the Forest Service, especially in the Gorge. And so because we had such a good relationship, we were able to get in and start scouting in in late November and December, we were already in there helping to scout the trails post the fire and do some assessments. And then in January, we took select experienced crew leaders and started doing trail work in there with the Forest Service. Set up a rule that we would only have experienced crew leaders, and we would always have 2 crew leaders on every crew that had experience. And we said you have to have two work parties in the burn area before you lead a crew. And that was to get them over the wow factor of going in and seeing something like you see on the screen right now. So that the leaders weren't doing that same jaw-dropping, oh my gosh, look. Then after a few crews, and we had some crew leaders qualified by having some experience, we were off and running and leading crews on our own. A few other of the added precautions we had was that we had a radio sandwich, so people in the front and the back, the 2 crew leaders had radios, and everybody had to work in between those. We didn't let anybody work on their own off behind. And of course we had extra safety precautions and extra check-ins with dispatch and stuff like that, because these trails were still closed and we were the first ones in after scouting. So we were able to get the trails open that we worked on. Most of them we were able to get open by mid-June. So we were working really hard right through the rain. And this picture is of scouting, but yeah, we scouted in the rain too. I think that's
Okay.
Hey,
And
go for it.
so, yeah, familiar story, working with the land managers early on, going out and scouting. This photo is from scouting with state parks at the Upper McCord Creek. This is a pretty minimally damaged trail in this particular spot compared to other spots we'd seen. After we would work with the land manager and look at the trails with them, we would start bringing in our volunteer crews and clearing the way and making it safe for further crews, prioritize that first. So like clearing brush, clearing logs, things like that, so that other crews could come through and tackle the tread work and things like that to get the trail back into shape so it was safe for regular visitors. I do want to mention that huge behind the scene effort, not just the trail stewards, but between the land managers, ODOT, contractors, everybody had to really communicate together in planning, because we needed to make sure that all of them could operate safely in that area and still be productive. So we couldn't be like working on a trail where rocks would fall on the historic highway if contractor vehicles were going to drive by. So there's a lot of interlocking infrastructure there to consider. The other thing that happened right after the fire was there was thousands of people expressing interest in volunteering long before there was actually the ability to get in there and do work. So we tried to hold extra trail parties so that people could kind of train up a little bit on trail work, so that they wouldn't be dealing with their first trail party in addition to the overwhelm of being in the fire affected areas. And we ended up more than doubling our crew leader capacity throughout the course of the work on the fire affected area, just because of that extra excitement and the just huge rush of people that wanted to work on things. And it really helped us build our relationship with the Forest Service and the land managers. And it helped inspire our first weekend training event, our tread school, that was based off of the amazing Trail Skills College that we hold in Cascade Locks every year with the PCTA and WTA and everybody else that contributes to that one, just because of that extra capacity need that there was for training volunteers. So there's just a lot going on behind the scenes and a lot learned through the process in terms of capacity and training as well.
Okay, kind of right into it, Susan, is question number 2. And that question related to the fire affected areas in your chat window there. from regular trail maintenance activities, what was part of the safety review before, and what were the unique safety issues while out on those trails?
Yeah, so lots is different when you're working on a trail in a fire affected area, especially recently affected. First, the key is communication, both communication between the crew and the dispatch or the incident commander or the land manager to make sure everyone knows where everybody's at, because there's a lot going on. And a lot of people need to be aware that there are people in this closed area. And then the communication of hazards to the crew. And so to that point, we added fire area specific topics to our regular trail safety talk. Some of them came directly from job hazard assessment provided by the Forest Service for their areas for that Eagle Creek fire event. And those included things that are somewhat common sense, but need to be emphasized, like situational awareness, look up, look down, and look around. Looking up for things that might drop on you, like weakened tree limbs or broken tree limbs. Looking around at rock slides, low trees that are near you, other volunteers, what's your escape route, things like that. And then looking down, because the footing is a lot more precarious when a lot of rocks and debris have fallen on the trail and there's already spring growth of plants over top of it. So sometimes there's just looks like this beautiful green mat of plants to walk on, and there's a bunch of ankle twisting rocks to step on as well. After the look up, look down, and look around, there's the fun little weird terms you get for the specific fire dangers. We've got torpedo logs that rest on top of rocks and can easily slide down the hill. Widower makers, or some people call them widow makers, those branches that can fall out of trees that are more common after a fire. Hell holes, which are holes that are cavities underneath the trail. Roberta will have a great picture of that on one of her slides. I'll leave that to her to describe. And then just the dangers associated with rock slides and the dynamic landscape after a fire has come through, and then you've had a winter of snow, wind, and rain to activate the landscape. Some other things to talk about that aren't specifically physical, but considerations for your crew size. Is your crew going to be crowded when they're really, really restricted to being on the trail and on rock slides or near fallen logs? Do you need to have spotters there for people to keep an eye on the rocks above you and logs to protect the crew that's working, because they can't work and pay attention to the environment at the same time effectively? Strict enforcement of PPE, your protective equipment, making sure that everybody's got boots, gloves, eye protection, and hard hats, and just being really strict about it. If people come with tennis shoes, you just can't come on the trail party. You just can't. It's too dangerous in there. Allowing extra time to get in and out of the area because of the precariousness of the footing, and then making sure you always have an escape plan for just locally if you're working on a rock slide in particular, and then in general for leaving the area if the winds whip up or weather changes on you. And then this picture is about the usual times you have time to relax when you're on a trail party at lunchtime. You notice everybody still has their hard hats on. You can't really take your hard hats on in an area where you've got higher risk, like in a fire affected area. And choosing your lunch location can be tricky as well, because your exposure time goes up when you're just sitting in one place rather than moving along working. And so that increases the hazard risk. So being aware that you might need to keep an eye out for a lunch location the whole time you get there, or plan ahead, because you can't just plop down wherever you are on the trail and relax. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up is relieving yourself and leave no trace when you can't get off the trail because it's unsafe. You may have to make some compromises there in terms of relieving yourself near the side of the trail, letting people know where you're going, and then trying to find privacy in an area that's been burned out can be tricky also. So those are all things to think about when you're going to take a crew out and stay safe in a burned area.
Thanks, Susan. And yeah, Roberta, take it away. Here's what Susan was talking about.
Yeah, so here's an example of what she was calling a hellhole, or just either a burned limb or a burned root, burned stump. And this is right on the trail. And that was a surprise to me when I started working after the fire. And you can easily post hole like in snow through these. In fact, when we were first talking about it, our Forest Service person, Dawn, she immediately stepped in one and went up to her knee. So it happens. But those were early on. Of course, that was something we resolved right away and filled those holes with rocks, and it being the gorge and the moss being burned off, finding rocks was pretty easy. So we were able to fill those holes, and then that wasn't really a danger that we considered much anymore. The torpedo logs are logs that are aligned with the fall line. And since there's nothing holding them anymore, they can come down with ease. Again, in the gorge, it turns out that beautiful layer of moss was just covering endless piles of tangerine to melon-sized rocks that would come down. Here's the picture on the right. I don't know my right from my left. Is Multnomah Falls, and that's one of the switchbacks. And you can't even really see the switchback other than the number. And so clearing that was tricky because you had to kind of work your way all the way up to the top and then clear rocks going down and you cleared the same rocks 5 or 6 times, but being very careful not to hit anybody below. The picture on the left is just to say one surprise was how sooty you get. We all know we get dirty doing trail work, but being out there right after the fire, you just got so sooty that we added a recommendation that everybody really brings a change of clothes because you get it all over the place. And we went through more extensive reviews with our crew leaders called a deliberative risk assessment before we went out, and we went through that with the Forest Service. So that was kind of an added safety thing. Once our crew leaders were trained up, they just knew to cover those topics in the safety talk that we had with our volunteers once we got regular volunteers out on the trail. And I will add that the one thing we had to send people home for was showing up with inadequate footwear. Didn't really, I mean, everybody knew to wear the long pants and the hard hats and everything else, but getting people to consistently wear the right boots it's sad to send a volunteer home, but we had to, and we did. And I think that's.
I'm remembering too, with those branches in the background of her, how it almost was like kiln dried wood out there, and it was hardened because of that hot, energy around it, even if it was still intact. And we were running through saws, dulling saws quicker and taking longer to cut through some of that stuff.
Yeah, and we did just throw this in too. We did talk earlier about the brushiness, and the brush was really treetops that had bent over and were blocking the trail. So there was a lot of hard cutting to get through the first few times.
Yeah. Thank you, Roberta. Gabe, take it away. You might be on mute.
I apologize for that. So we have a lot of experience working in areas that had burned 5-10 years previous. We got in there, and that's illustrated here in this picture. So this is from around 2011. No one had worked on this trail in the footprint of the 2002 Biscuit Fire until we got in there around 2010 or 2011. And so in that case, you have to be really considerate of, what I call jack straws. These are areas where lots of small diameter, typically, trees have kind of formed stacks, and they'll often pin brush down. And so brush will come to grow with being pinned down by these small trees. And when you go to cut those logs, you have the effect of a spring pole. And we encountered a whole lot of that in the early days of trail recovery in the Biscuit Fire. In the same vein, you're working in areas where you have very little visibility. These stacks of trees can make it hard to know where the ground is. And some hazards that come with that are, bees nests, things that you don't anticipate. And so being able to slowly gain visibility through cutting through these areas in a surgical and deliberate way was really important. But the other two panelists have done a great job of summing it up. So other than that, I don't have a whole lot more to share.
No, and I like your photos here, the before and after of the same spot. What amazing work. Okay, back to you, Roberta. A big log.
Yeah, going from the little logs to the big logs. Are we on question 4?
Question
No,
3.
3.
Yep. So what was the process
Yeah.
methodology around the restoration of trails?
Yeah, so we definitely were trying to get open to the public first, so we didn't worry about getting the trail completely up to spec. We totally endorsed keeping the wilderness standard, and this is a 54-inch log on Gorton Creek Trail, which is in wilderness. And it took us 4 work parties to cut this guy out. It actually took 3 full cuts. And we have a lot of volunteers, so we didn't want to drop the wilderness requirement of using crosscut saws. Plus, we have a lot of volunteers who are crosscut certified, probably more than we have chainsaw certified volunteers. But we did focus on getting the trails open and coming back to do tread work later. This photo is Multnomah Falls Trail, which I think we cleared 3 or 4 times, and I think TKO cleared 1 or 2 times. I mean, it was rockfall that just kept giving. And so getting it open carefully, and sometimes we'd have to hike for 3-4 hours to do 3 hours of work just to get fully into where we needed to work. But by focusing on getting the trails open, we were able to get the trails open by mid-June that we had started working on in January, February.
Yeah, I recall going out with you and the PCTA team right there from Bridge of the Gods and having kind of like that rain stick sound of these rocks, like this photo, and having it just all people in the crew were doing the same thing, and it was just like a rain stick sound of little pebbles rolling down the mountain. It was really kind of pretty.
It was a very different sound.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Susan.
Yeah, so yeah, there were various levels and types of damage on the trails. And so the approach varied from place to place, as well as based on how much traffic the trails got and which types of users were going to be on them, whether they're going to be the casual users or more seasoned hikers would be accessing them. So like in this photo, I'm just clearing some logs off of the trail on the 400 near Ainsworth State Park. And there wasn't a lot of intense, large mechanical, technical work, but just removing a lot of the debris and then trying to do as best we could to get up to spec whilst still getting enough trail done to keep things moving along. If you want to look at the next picture, Um, this is a little bit more substantial obstacle. I don't believe I was on the crew that cut that log, but we had rocks this size on the trail. And one of the priorities for the 400 trail between Multnomah Falls and Ainsworth was just getting the big debris off the trail so that it wasn't going to fall onto the historic highway once more crews would come through to actually finish work on the trail. So those were kind of faster working, not going up the full spec, but just getting stuff off the trail so that future efforts weren't going to trigger things falling down and causing danger to people driving on the highway. The next photo, this is an example of where the trail just was washed away, slid away from a slide on the right. Basically, you would have just walked straight across that gap. And so this took a little bit more time where we had to bench in brand new trail just to make it passable. And then I think the next one is a gabion installation. Some of the rock slides damaged the trail to the point where we had to install gabions. For those who aren't familiar, they're basically a metal mesh cage filled with rocks that act like a giant brick. And so you put it in the trail. They're usually like 3 feet wide, 6 to 12 feet long, and maybe 18 inches to 2 feet deep. And this is an example of an excavation. There's one spot on the switchbacks up to Multnomah Falls where they were clearing hazard trees and a 12 to 16 inch diameter tree speared the trail and then broke off. And we had to excavate down, cut that off, and put a gabion in. It was just past the Benson Bridge. That was a kind of fun little project too. And this last one is from the Angel's Rest Trail. This is one we spent a lot of time on because it gets a lot of traffic. It's a lot of, inexperienced hikers. It's one of the first hikes they'll want to go on in the gorge. And it's really nearly impossible to get major maintenance done on it when the trail is open because there are so many people on it. And so this is a particular trail where TKO took extra time. In this case, they're moving what we called pancake rock and using it to reinforce the corner of a switchback. And yeah, on this trail in particular, we did a lot of rock work, and it actually offered opportunities for us to engage larger numbers of volunteers because we would have a tread crew working down low. And then we actually had a rock team that worked up higher. So we could teach people rock skills because that opportunity, an opportunity where the rocks are abundant and easy to see arises when you have a fire come through. And so we were able to take advantage of that while Angel's Rest was closed to do some major maintenance work.
Yeah, that actually is another thing of when the area had been completely cleaned of all vegetation, that was a great chance to spot that perfect rock for a rock structure. Within 3 months, you would have never been able to find it. Thanks, Susan. Gabe, what do we have here?
So what you're looking at is a large section of the footprint that we work in. And if you can kind of see the purple polygons, those are the wilderness areas where we mostly work in and just outside of. The black and the red lines are trails that we've adopted over the years. And then those shaded polygons in yellow and different gradients of red that's the fire history of our area. So each color is a distinct fire that's occurred. And I don't know if you can see on your screens, but those yellow polygons that have kind of a gridded texture in them, those are fires that are still going on right now. So as you can see, we have been working in interface of one fire stacked up on top of another. And it's just kind of the reality of the climate that we work in. And so that's given us an ability to kind of develop some long-term strategies at trail stewardship in the footprint of these fires. And I'll just come out and say that this is a marathon working and sustainable and in good shape. It's not a few years, it's at least 10 years. And we kind of look at it in the context of being about a 20-year plan after each fire. And so we develop stewardship plans that address different things going on. And there's just a lot of variation. And I saw someone asked about, what does that evaluation look like? And these elements on your screen here are a big part of it. So process looks different in different areas depending on, starting with the ecology. A forest that was a large, an old growth conifer forest in the Smith River drainage with nice coastal soils, that's going to look a lot different than a low elevation hardwood forest on a river basin. So that ecological aspect is the first one we look at. What was the forest type? What are the soil types? What's going to grow well? And in which areas are things not going to grow well afterwards? Another thing we really consider is aspect. Is this a high wind area? There's places in the footprint of the Biscuit Fire where there are still, almost 20 years later, thousands and thousands and thousands of snags that burned in that fire, but they're in areas that don't get a lot of wind. And so, you have to kind of, when you're making those stewardship plans, those long-term stewardship plans, you have to account for that. The same with sun exposure. If you have an area that is north facing and high elevation, the brush isn't going to grow back the same way it's going to at 2,000 feet on a south-facing slope with good soil. Slope and placement of the trail. A ridgetop trail is going to behave much differently than one that's at the bottom of a river canyon or mid-slope. So that's always something to consider, especially when you're looking at erosion and filling in of your actual trail bed. The burn severity, that's really something to consider. We've found that lots of places where we thought that the old growth conifers were going to live, they haven't. And so, sometimes it takes a few years for these trees to die. And, whether or not there's a canopy in place just after the fire, it makes a big difference. But, we kind of take all these considerations and we build a 20-year plan to identify, okay, well, here's where it's going to need a lot of attention at this point in time and what type of prescriptions are going to be needed where. And so it's a very dynamic process, but you can plan really well for that just looking at all these considerations early on in that evaluation. Now, that gets into financial considerations because, just after a fire, there's often a fair bit of money and resources available. People are really excited the next year to do something. You have a swell of volunteer support. But in many cases, you might have an area that is going to need the most resources 10 years in. And so that's something to consider as you're making those stewardship plans. They need to kind of align with your funding needs. And something that we've been able to kind of capitalize on right after these fires is when people are feeling emotional and they're feeling very generous just after a fire, take those donations and create funds in your books. If you're able to invest those in appropriate type of instruments that are secure, then that's great because, in that case where you identify a trail or a section of a trail that you can kind of see, hey, this is going to get bad in about 8 years. Boy, if you can take that $10,000 investment and put it in an 8-year fund, you can kind of get those finances to match the stewardship needs. And I guess, in that same vein, you can't let your constituency, your agency partners, your stakeholders, your membership, your donors forget about these fires. We still point all the time to the 2002 Biscuit Fire. We're still working on trails that are sustaining damage from the 2002 Biscuit Fire. And so bringing each fire some animation and a little bit of a story behind it, and being able to kind of follow that and keep people updated as time goes on is really, really important, because if you let that narrative die just after the fire, if 2021 comes and there's a new fire and you haven't kept this narrative from 2020 alive, people just forget. And no one wants to hear about a fire in 2013, not hear anything for 10 years, and then you go to your stakeholders, your funders, your agency partners, your donors, whoever, and all of a sudden, you're beating that drum for a fire that happened 10 years ago that they haven't heard anything about since. So just keeping the memories of these alive, but in a really positive light, and sharing the wins as you kind of go through is really important. We know that a lot of what we see is actually positive on the ground ecologically, and sharing that, hey, you're going to want to continue to go to this place. It is not ruined. It is still a beautiful and wild landscape, but we need your help to keep it open in the long term. That can go a long ways, and it can go a long ways in building trust too with your constituency, because over the course of years, they begin to see that you're serious and that you're committed, and that you have the capacity that it takes to keep these places open, ideally in perpetuity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm having flashes of the same stuff in the gorge that we deal with too, Gabe. Last week and this coming week, we're at Oneonta Gorge. We've got fire recovery efforts on closed trails still right in the heart of the gorge. And it's hard because you have these next rounds of fires that are now enticing and motivating a lot of people as well. It all matters. I really like these maps. Did you build these maps, or what was the resource of these?
Yeah, we build those maps internally.
Okay, great. Oh, now we're gonna completely shift gears, but not so much. Our question 4 is, anything unexpected, or any tools, equipment, methods that people should be gathering, training that might be beneficial, other methods that you learn through your experience. Susan, what the heck is going on here?
This is at the beginning of one of our trail parties we worked on the Larch Mountain Trail. We were doing our trail talk on the parking lot at Multnomah Falls, and this crew showed up and were very intrigued by us, maybe as intrigued as we were by them. They were the League of Extraordinary Floofs.
Awesome. Well, question number 4, we don't have a lot of slides to go along with this, but to the panel, are there things unique to your experience in these fire affected areas, that anything else that you wanted to share before we move into Q&A, which, folks, if you're not paying attention, please note the Q&A window to add more questions, and we'll do the best we can. I think we already have a few. So we got 4 minutes before Q&A. Any of the panelists have anything to add for question 4?
I've got a quick one. A couple of them were inspired by things that Roberta and Gabe said. Roberta mentioned switchbacks and not dropping rocks on people. When I was leading trail parties on Larch Mountain Trail, we walked up the switchbacks before the PCTA cleared them. And it was very important to make sure that everybody got to the corner before the rest of the line started going up the next switchback so that they wouldn't kick rocks down on the people below. That's kind of a technique that a lot of people don't follow when it's a regular trail. It's not been affected by a fire, but especially in a place like the gorge where it's all loose rock and a fire's come through. That's a really critical safety aspect just on your walk in. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up was the picture I had with everybody wearing their hard hats. That was a lunch where we actually partnered with the Friends of the Columbia River Gorge, and they went in with us while we were working on a gabion installation. They went in and were removing invasive plants. And so that's an opportunity for trail crews to collaborate with conservation groups in trail recovery, especially in front country areas where invasive introduction can be pretty quick and take over after a fire.
Thanks, Susan. Roberta.
Yeah, I'd like to add, since there's such this outpouring of people wanting to help, we jumped on using our Trail Skills College course curriculum, which is available to anybody. The Trails 100, which was an intro to trails, and Trails 101. So we started holding pub talks, and I know the other organizations did things very similarly, but this is my experience. We held 1 hour trail talks where pub talks where we would introduce the concepts of trail maintenance, maybe show some tools, the ideas about trail design, just some really high level global things, what you could do as a volunteer. And then we would throw in updates on the Eagle Creek fire too, so that would give people an idea of what's happening and feel like they're getting some inside scoop. This was long before the trails were open. We were holding these in January and February and March. Gave people something to do, something to direct them to. And then we also had Trails 101 class, which was first time volunteers. And we worked on the Washington side of the gorge, which wasn't burned. So we got really good trail work done, and we got a whole bunch of people at least one chance of doing some trail work. So that worked out to engage the volunteers that were so forthcoming.
Yeah, actually, you're feeding this next slide that I kind of just threw in there for placement, but all of these people in this group, only 2 of which were crew leaders prior to essentially December 2017. All these people were motivated by the Eagle Creek fire and wanting to be activated. They started to come to trail parties that were open and available outside the fire affected area, got training, got into a pipeline towards assistant crew leader levels. And then now, I mean, some of these people are staff, some of these people continue to lead crews elsewhere and in the fire affected area. So those trainings that we did during that, you can't do anything now. I know you want to grab a tool while the stumps are still burning. Wasn't going to happen, but we did get them activated, and it was a great chance to bring some people into a leadership pipeline for sure. All right.
I wanted to
Gabe, anything to add, or anybody else?
The only thing I would add is that your saws working in these fire areas, they need a lot more attention, and we found that out. The fire hardened wood, the soot, it takes a toll on your crosscuts and your chainsaws. So bear that in mind.
Yeah. The guy in the front of this photo with the dark brown mustache, he's our saw sharpener, so he can attest to that for sure. I'd also say just that idea of that those trees might not be falling right now, like you mentioned, but in 8 to 10 years they are. And so saw program lifts and trainings around more technical skills, rock and saw and rigging, are going to be things that are kind of a long-term goal to get people in a pipeline towards training as well. So I feed that in this moment.
I was going to bring up one more thing that the pandemic has been kind of similar to a fire in terms of not being able to get volunteers on the trail for a while. And I think that we switched to doing webinars and online training and things like that. And so those are things that can be taken advantage of in preparation of fires also. We've got some really cool animations in our new Trail Eyes video clip series that are really cool on our Scout School page. And I might just share the link here. I hadn't watched them until recently, and I was like, whoa, these are really cool. So I found them pretty exciting.
I just put them in the window for it.
Cool, you got it.
Well, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and we'll go to some Q&A. And we had one question in the chat that maybe we could start with from Michelle Mitchell. And it says, is there any, oh, wait a minute. Is that the one? She had a few questions. Is there any remote imaging or perhaps drone photography outside wilderness areas you wish you could get for future fire damaged trail restoration planning? Anything you'd like burned area emergency response teams to know about of your data needs while they conduct their assessments, those first level assessments? Very good question. I don't know, kind of pointing at Gabe on this one, since you had that beautiful historical fire map. If you know that there's some crews, Forest Service crews or land manager crews going out and doing those surveys and those assessments at first, is there anything from the trails lens that you would want as soon as you could?
Well, I'd be interested in continuing the discussion with the forest and Michelle about that, because I think that there's an opportunity there to help each other out. We haven't had a standardized way of doing that. We go and we scout, we take tedious notes about kind of all those considerations I laid out previously, and then we aggregate those to develop those long-term work plans that I kind of described. So I absolutely think there's an opportunity to extend and deepen partnership opportunities in collecting that data and getting the right information to partner groups or your Forest Service recreation program staff who can use that data and develop those types of plans I described.
So Roberta and Susan, you both were like intimately involved after the Eagle Creek fire. I mean, Roberta, I think I've seen photos and you were part of crews as early December 2017. And then I know Susan and I took first trips up places like Angel's Rest and gosh, the Yeon Trail section up to Forest Service. I wonder, Roberta, anything in those assessments that either you did or that you were given from the Forest Service, anything more to yield from there?
I think the status of some of the trail structures, the was helpful. I know it's obvious about the bridge. Is the bridge there? Is the bridge burned? But some of the smaller structures that are still really important, rock walls and things like that, were some of the things that we noticed, and some of the things that we were getting help from the other people doing scouting. I think that's the big, of course, the aerial and all the burn area severity maps, those helped a lot. And as we looked before we put boots on the ground.
Can I just say from my experience, it was share early and invite partner groups to be a part of that if possible. Obviously, safety, life safety first. You're doing something very risky, but I do know that both PCTA and TKO built trust. And once our crew leaders had those eyes on it, it was that much quicker for them to be able to project plan out and work plan out when we'd be leading crews and when it was above our heads too, right? When it really needed something technically or, you know, in a risk category beyond volunteer pay grade, right? I would say that. We got got a lot of questions. So you all see these. If anybody jumps in on any of these, Laura Fredrickson says, necessity of doing an initial evaluation, Gabe. Is there a tool or form that you worked with to determine level of severity in particulars? Any of
Like yeah, I would, like I said, we don't have a great method. We take really detailed notes in the field and we store those and we bring them out. So we haven't gotten there.
Yeah. And then the second part Laura had was kind of tools from the Forest Service that were provided. I mean, I think Roberta, you all from PCTA had great assessment tools already in place, kind of reporting tools and everything that we glommed onto TKO and utilized. So there's some out there that we could share. PCTA also has a really great website, web link in here that you should check out. And they also have a lot of their tools on their website. Any other ones? We're getting close to the end of our time. I would say that we can stay on for a little bit. Other people, if you have to jump off at 2:30, that's our official time. Thank you for joining. 2 minutes left. How about, what was the timeline criteria you used to ask, request the go-ahead for volunteer, for volunteer groups to help prepare the trails or help get in the trails? Susan, did you want to kind of jump on this one? Roberta as well?
I mean, I think we just worked with the land managers to get in as soon as it was safe. And, you know, they had their own experts trying to determine whether it was safe for even their staff to go in. And then once their staff were allowed, we would try and accompany them when we could. That was like when we went up with the Forest Service on Angel's Rest. I joined a PCTA member and some search and rescue folks scouting out Nesmith, just teaming up with them when we can early on so that we get the information as soon as we can to see what our capacity is to help and understand the issues so that when, you know, they've determined it's safe to have volunteers in, that we're ready to go.
Yeah, from 0% contained to 100% contained to fire declared actually out. I mean, Roberta, you were in there when it was 1% contained. The fire wasn't out yet, right?
Right. But we had seen the burn severity maps, and so we knew that we were starting on lesser severity things. I want to address the specifics to equestrians. One of the concerns we had early on was those burn holes and the fact that our boots wouldn't cause as much of a post hole condition as bringing a horse or mule, especially one loaded, onto the trail. And we worked hard to get the trail hardened or checked for hardening between Wanham Lake, the PCT from Wanham Lake over to the Benson Plateau. And so we did some extra work there. That was a very low severity burn, so we were pretty confident. But I think that's the biggest limitation for backcountry horsemen.
There you go.
Before willing to let them in.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Possibility of postponement.
Okay.
Got a shout out for one more kind of tool before we go. We didn't bring up rock rakes for clearing rock slides, and I think those are really awesome. They're kind of like a multi-tined cultivator type rake looking thing, and they are really, really great for those mixes of like fist to melon sized rocks where your regular tread tools just bounce off of them, and pick matic can't really grab enough at a time.
Yeah, in prep for this, we talked about not a lot of us had those like all the time in our tool cache out on a regular maintenance project, but that became like the tool of choice for those first waves of clearing so that it was safe for volunteers, and then getting in and doing the repair for safe for the public. Yeah. Gosh, well, I think we're out of time. A lot of good questions in here. I wonder if we'll be able to maybe take some of these and in a response be able to answer some of them. I really appreciate people doing that, asking good questions. Steph, I believe you are on to finish things off, or am I just making that up?
I'm happy to jump in. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We can also share a few of the links that were shared in the chat today and kind of the email that comes out. I think it should hit your inboxes in about 24 hours as a follow-up. So we invite folks to take a follow-up survey give us some feedback on this session if you learned what you were hoping to learn. So please look out for that survey. And yeah, we'll share some of the links from the chat in the follow-up email as well. And then we'll post a recording of the webinar a little bit down the line. Kind of that'll happen all in one batch after the summit is over. So probably a couple weeks out yet. So thanks so much to all of our presenters for joining us and to our summit sponsors for supporting all of our programming. The next webinar that we're offering as part of the summit is tomorrow's Health and Nature's partnership webinar, and I'll just posted that link if you're interested in registering for tomorrow's webinar in the chat. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steph.
There's some good questions in here. I wish we had more time to answer them. Thanks, Susan.
Yep, no problem. Talk to you soon.